Tonight we're exploring what it might look like to live in a clean economy, why we need it, how far we have to go, what it takes to get there, and what we need to do to make it happen. We're looking at this in the face of a federal government still assuring us that it will all be okay if we just chug along with business as usual, which is profoundly fossil fuel based. And this is what they say: we accept that climate change is real, but we're too small to matter. It's a problem for everyone else to solve. This flies in the face of the urgency for all countries to move away from such economies as flagged by the last IPCC report. Authorities point out that Australia stands to be drastically impacted by climate change. It's already doing so. So it stands to reason that we should be doing our utmost to address this issue. If we are relying on others elsewhere to take it seriously, why should they if we don't? We remain frustrated as a group of locals concerned about climate change, and we continue to run these forums in the territory of our Treasurer to highlight the need for the federal government to reconsider their position. But with the urgency of taking such action now, it is the time to think about other ways of making progress, ways that challenge or circumvent the dampening effect of our federal government. Our state government is taking the lead in many ways, as well as the business world, and then there's the community rising all around the world. There are many, many good reasons why we should be heading fast towards a clean economy, and waiting for the federal government to catch up doesn't seem like the best approach. Things are already moving. Some phrases like value capture and what that means exactly, an 8-to-1 cost-benefit ratio, and mainstreaming energy positive housing, all these sort of things are things you'll hear about tonight. And tonight is the start of a longer term process for us. We're collecting information, ideas and visions more than you can hold in your head, and you may need to revisit it. We have links in our website to the slides you'll see tonight. We have Facebook Live to revisit, and we have videos on YouTube, or we will in a few days' time. We're doing this because of the need for all of you to be part of moving this country towards a clean economy, and you need ammunition. On your seats you'll find information, except the sheet that I'm about to refer to, I don't think is on your seat. Can I ask Mick if the sheet I am referring to is available?
Yes, it's gone out very late. Phillip has handed it out the last 10 minutes.
So it's not on the seat, but it is on this. Right. I needlessly worried. You have something from our energy transition group, which you're not expected to read tonight. This is what I refer to as your ammunition. Take it with you and read it. A collection of experts like the ones we have here tonight does not happen every day. It's part of what we do in building a broad-based movement here to go well beyond our little group of lighter footprinters. And things will move if you're part of that movement.
It's really a pleasure to be here. It's always a pleasure to come along to Lighter Footprints events. As Carolyn mentioned, I chair the Climate Action Network of Australia. That's an organisation that brings together environment groups, local community organisations like Lighter Footprints, unions, health sector organisations, faith groups, the Aid and Development Network, to come together and work strategically on climate change, and to think about how we can work best together and actually make sure our impact is greater than the sum of our parts. Because we know the scale of the change we need is so enormous, all of society has a part to play, and we need to do that work together. And to be able to have in our network organisations like Lighter Footprint lighter footprints that create a really genuine connection to communities and feed that in strategically into those network conversations is incredibly important. And of all the different community climate action groups I have the pleasure to work with, Lighter Footprint has a very unique ability to turn out a crowd on a weeknight for an event like this. So well done to all of the volunteers who have made this happen. But you also have a really phenomenal way of engaging with the real depth of the issues that we are facing and bringing new people into those discussions. And tonight is a real testament to that skill and that network and being able to provide those opportunities for discussion to the community. So as I said, it is a real pleasure to be involved. Carolyn mentioned Slido before, and I do just want to point out how important that is to make the most of tonight's opportunity that you all have. You're about to hear from 3 of Australia's leading thinkers in this space, people who have been a part of absolutely changing the debate, domestically and internationally, and creating the infrastructure, the policy infrastructure that is so essential for this change to be possible. You're going to hear from each of those speakers tonight. They're going to come up and speak for about 15 minutes each, and I'll introduce them one at a time. And then we are going to take our seats here, and I have the pleasure of moderating a discussion amongst our panellists. But the themes that I choose will entirely be informed by all of you. So by going to Slido, by putting in your questions as you're thinking about issues that are arising or hearing from the speakers and wanting to know more, or if there are things that are not touched on that you think we really need to be addressing, make sure you're putting it in. Carolyn mentioned that I certainly won't get to all of the questions, but it will give me a flavour of what the audience is most interested in, and that will be able to guide where we go. As was mentioned, you can also vote on other people's questions. So again, we get a sense of where the enthusiasm and the interest really is. So please do go ahead. It's not a difficult app to use if you have any trepidation about that. So on to our speakers. Security in the School of Biosciences and the School of Ecosystem and Forest Sciences at the University of Melbourne. Tom is a member of the ANU Climate Change Institute and was formerly the director of the Crawford School of Public Policy at ANU from 2009 to 2015. Tom works with all levels of government in Australia and internationally on biosecurity, energy, and the economics of climate change. His most recent issues paper for the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute was titled Australia's Clean Economy Future, Costs and Benefits. And when Tom's not leading research in environment economics, Tom likes to play on his 10 computers, which he has running in parallel at home at the same time. I don't know how many questions we're going to get through on Slido about that, but if that dominates the debate, you're not focused. Welcome, Tom. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much, Victoria. Yes, I am a geek, and proud to say so. Actually, more exactly, I'm an applied mathematician and an economist. That's normally a conversation stopper, especially on the weekends. But tonight I'm going to try and be a little bit more conversational. I've got a lot of detail and some graphics on the screen, some of which you might not be able to see that clearly, and that's okay. I just want to talk you through the issues and try and focus on some of the particular measures and figures that are relevant for us. Everyone says that the cost of doing nothing, the cost of business as usual, will invoke tremendous damages, not only to Australia but to the global economy. And they always say the cost of emissions reduction is much lower than that, but no one gives you precise figures. No one tells you exactly what the numbers are. And that's what we're able to do, and that's what I want to take you through, both for the globe and for Australia in particular. It's important to talk about the global picture because the distribution of the damages from climate change is very uneven, very heterogeneous. Some countries get pounded much more than others, and that's something that we should keep in mind and think about as we look at this sort of material and go forward. Right, first slide. So where are we now? Well, it's not good. We know that climate change is happening more rapidly than we thought it was. In particular, the effects of climate change are happening more rapidly. The science for predicting global temperature increases is pretty robust, but the effects are starting to be felt, and quite severely in some places. We know there are more destructive hurricanes, and we know that there are, every year, rather horrible fires on every continent except Antarctica. And those fires are quite damaging, generating sort of real concerns for livelihoods and also food security. We know that water supplies are shrinking, and some parts of the world are threatened by drought, and indeed by fire. California at the moment is burning. Australia, as you know, is in a drought in many parts of the country. The ocean is warming. Why? Because temperatures are increasing. We know that sea levels are increasing because the ice is melting. And indeed, when oceans warm, it affects fish populations, and quite dramatically. They either move or they suffer. And that's happening in particular all up and down the southeast coast of Australia, down to Tasmania. Fish populations are really struggling. So when sea level rises, of course, it threatens not only Pacific Island nations, but coastal nations, coastal properties, coastal cities everywhere. And indeed, it's not just Ho Chi Minh and Miami and Shanghai. It's everywhere. There's a particular concern at the moment going forward about the southeast coast of Victoria and what's going to happen in the next 20 or 30 years. So we know that's happening, and indeed it may be happening again, faster than we thought. We also know that there's record high temperatures in many parts of the world. Indeed, some parts of the world are basically unlivable. So we want to sort of tease out what the potential damages from this sort of set of events, these things that are happening, are going forward. See if we can put a real accurate, reasonably accurate dollar number on the kinds of damages that have been we're likely to incur. Economists have not been good at this. Economists have vastly underestimated the damages from climate change, starting with a very famous climate model by Nordhaus, for which he received the Nobel Prize. Tonight we're going to look at something that's a little more dimensionally large and a little more exact in terms of the kinds of damages we could expect, knowing that I haven't captured everything in particular. Next slide, please. So this is a big slide with a lot of words that you don't have to look at. But what we do is we form a very large dimensional global trade and climate model. 139 countries across 50 or 60 different commodity groups where you can consume and trade between countries, within a country, globally. All right? It includes agriculture, manufacturing, infrastructure, transport, all kinds of commodities that are produced, fossil fuels, renewables, all kinds of energy sources. And we track that system globally and how it's impacted by climate change in this global trading context. It's the largest dimensional model that you can get for the economics of climate change. Next slide, please. Attached to that, we use what are called damage functions. What's the effect of an increase in temperature on that global setting, in particular in those sectors, if we have business as usual, or if we transition to a cleaner economy, as we should. Now, for tonight, the damages in particular that we're going to look at are the loss in agricultural productivity, which is profound, particularly when there is fires and floods and heat waves, and also some sea level rise that affects land in particular. We're going to look at falls in labor productivity, and we're going to look at, along with sea level rise in terms of inundation effects, generally speaking, human health effects. We want to add up these damages as we go forward with different kinds of assumptions about what's happening to global temperatures. We're not including infrastructure damage from sea level rise. I'll do that in the end when I talk about Australia. And we're not including a lot of the fire events so far that might be relevant. So when I give you dollar numbers for damages, keep in mind that's only a limited set of damages that are being estimated. Much better than what we've been doing so far, but it's still limited. Next slide, please. And here's the point. This is a graph you may have seen. But when you get small changes in global temperatures, even though it's only 1 or 2 degrees, you get a lot more variability in temperature extremes, in particular in hot temperature extremes. So when you move from 25 to 27 degrees on average, You can see you go from the black to the red zone. You get more variation in temperatures. You get higher temperatures and more variation in temperatures. This is standard in climate change modeling, typical. So you don't necessarily just have to focus on the average increase in temperature. You think about the extremes as well. And indeed, that'll be the case for the economics, because the economics generates extreme cases that are different in various parts of the world. So we have this global model, big, large dimensional global model. And we ask the question, what's the effect of a temperature profile going forward? Can we add up the damages? And we can. Slide, please. So we do two things. We add up the damages that might accrue long-term, say in about 80 years, and the damages that will accrue from now until 2100. One's the long-run damage, one's the cumulative damage. And you can see the numbers, here are the numbers. If you can't see them, it's okay. The numbers for the long-run damage are huge. They range from, at 2 degrees warming, from 5.6 trillion up to 23 trillion at 4 degrees warming. Everything on the screen, if you can see, it's in billions. So that's actually 23 trillion at 4 degrees. And it varies across countries, and I'll show you a nice graphic for that in a moment. Next slide. Here are the cumulative numbers. Now, they're massive. If you ask yourself, what's the cumulative damages from those things I listed, falls in agricultural and labor productivity, sea level rise in terms of inundation effects, some human health effects, what's the damages from that accrue globally? Well, it ranges at 2 degrees from 171 trillion, and these are big numbers, and I'll talk about what they mean in a second, from 171 trillion up to 604 trillion at 4 degrees. Massive, just massive. But how are they distributed? Next slide, please. Right, this is a nice graphic, I think, that tells you that there's heterogeneity in the damages that accrue as a result of climate change. Now, the scale here is the fall percentage change in GDP. GDP is this measure, you probably know, it's this measure of national income. So if GDP is falling, it usually means a recession or worse. And in fact, 2/4 of a fall in GDP, even of 1 or 2%, usually means a recession. So the scale here goes from 0 to minus 28%. Okay? It doesn't show very well on the screen, but I'll look at the numbers later for Australia. But Australia should be a little bit pink, but you can see where the reds are, where the massive changes in GDP are. They're in Africa, particularly Western Africa, all through South Asia and Southeast Asia and South America. That's where it's really going to matter, really going to get clobbered. It's bad enough in Australia, as you'll see, even with this limited set of damage functions, but those countries will really suffer. What does it mean? Next slide, please. Right? What do these big numbers mean? What's 604 trillion? Well, what's a loss in GDP of 28% if you're in Africa? Well, it's massive. Right? At the moment, Great Britain's worried about a potential fall in GDP of 4% with Brexit. They're concerned that there's a major recession coming with a 4% loss. Globally, the average loss here ranges from, it can vary depending upon assumptions on economic growth, from 3 to 10%. But the real point, we'll talk about Australia in a minute, the real point is that some countries really, really suffer. And in fact, many in our own neighborhood. You can see Cambodia, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, India, these are all 15 to 20% falls in GDP. There's heterogeneity in the damages, and it matters tremendously. Normal economic models just take global averages, and they'll say, well, GDP will fall 3 or 4 or 5%, and well, that's bad, but let's go on. But the heterogeneity, in fact, matters, really matters. Philippines, 20%. Parts of Africa, well over 26% falls in GDP. Now, you can imagine what that means, right? The global financial crisis in 2009 was estimated to have a fall in GDP from about roughly 4 to 5%, and it was tragic for the world economy. Imagine individual cases where you have falls in 28% in GDP. The Great Depression in the 1930s had an average fall of 15% in global GDP. So you're talking major economic meltdown. It's catastrophic. For those countries in particular, Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, everyone in our neighborhood, it'd be hard to imagine how they could survive fiscally, right? Because you're getting tremendous falls in incomes and production as a result of climate change and temperature increases. At the same time, you're trying to fund expenditures for emergency response. You can just imagine what will happen to the number of climate refugees under that setting, under that situation. It'd be quite bad. Something to worry about. Next slide. Okay, Australia. This is the graph that the Department of Energy and Environment uses for emissions. And it's the blue line is basically what's happened recently. And you can see that emissions are rising. The scale here is up to 700, right, from 300 to 700. If you rescale it a bit, and it's done specifically to make things look flatter. If you punch again, next slide, you'll see same data, but the scale's a bit different. You'll see that the carbon price period, Rudd-Gillard period, in fact, the carbon price was working, emissions were falling. Since then, emissions have just increased. The emergency emissions reduction fund's not very effective, apparently, right, because emissions have still been rising. Next slide. You may also note that we've got a long way to go. There's a challenge. There's hope, but there's a big challenge here because the amount of renewables in total electricity demand is still relatively small, 7 or 8%, and that's what this graphic shows. The gray on the top is the percentage of renewables in electricity demand, still small. Long way to go. Making progress, but still a long way to go. Next slide. So, what are the damages? What are the costs? If we do business as usual in Australia, what are the damages? Again, I use the same sort of large dimensional global platform to add up all these, albeit limited damage functions to determine what happens with business as usual. And in this context, unlike before, I include infrastructure damages, something we've been working on quite heavily here in Australia. And you can see out to 2050, the cumulative damages for infrastructure dominate. There's 611 billion. Sea level rise is going to be a real problem. Just from that alone, 611 billion. Falls in sort of productivity, about 151 billion. And if I extend that out to 2100, it's massive, right? Because temperature increases really pound productivity. Losses in biodiversity, about 246 billion. So the total just to 2050 is about 1.2 trillion Australian. These are conservative estimates with limited damage functions, assuming business as usual. If I take that out to 2100, it goes well over $6 trillion. You want to avoid that. And this is Australia, which isn't as impacted as some of those other countries we just talked about. Next slide. Okay, what about emissions reduction? What I wanted to do is just take a very mild renewable target. Let's assume that we have a 70% share of renewables in end-use energy consumption in 2050. What's the cost of that with the rest of the world on a Paris target? We can do much better than 70%, but I took the mild case. In fact, it's the case with land use change and a little bit of carbon capture that's consistent with zero net in 2050. If you can do better than 70%, it makes life easier. But I took the 70% case. What's the cost of that? Next slide. Well, it's not very large. You can see the change in GDP, because we'd be exporting less fossil fuels, it has a cost, $31.6 billion. The cost of energy transition to renewables, particularly in the transport sector where it's relatively expensive, and a lot of work needs to be done, is about $40 billion. Land use change and some NET, about $27 billion. The total cost is about 145 billion Australian dollars. The model runs in terms of US dollars, so don't be confused. I've converted to Australian. So you get 1.2 trillion in damages compared to 145 billion in the cost of emissions reduction. That's where the 8 to 1 comes from that Carolyn mentioned. And that's with limited damage functions. You take that out again to 2100, and the cost-benefit ratio, the benefit-cost ratio, goes well over 50 to 1. It's huge. For Victoria, the ratio is about 1 to 4. For Queensland, it's much higher. Queensland's on the front line when it comes to climate change. Next slide. So, I'll close on this one. You know, all the modeling we've done over the last decade or so, any model we look at, even the very sophisticated large dimensional models, show that the cost of emissions reduction is always far less than the damages with business as usual. What's nice about this is we can actually put numbers on them. We can say something specific. We could go into Treasury and say there's an 8-to-1 trade-off. What's wrong? Let's go. Right? If Australia is not part of the solution, it's part of the problem. Right? And indeed, the longer we wait, this is standard in economics, the longer we wait, the more expensive it will become to reduce emissions, the more the damages will be incurred. We've got to start acting, well, years ago, but certainly now. Have to act now to get this under control. Last slide. It's the thank you. Thank you very much. The slide will also have some links on the online version. Cheers. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tom. That was fantastic, an enormous download of information and really some very compelling figures in there. It just seems mind-boggling to me when you hear a lot of this, that there's still debate, that there's still discussion. But I guess that is our reality, and that is why we are here. Our next speaker is Peter Newman, the Distinguished Professor of Sustainability at Curtin University's Sustainability Policy Institute. Ah. Well, that could have been awkward. Lucky I didn't embarrass myself in a room full of people. Anthea, hi. Welcome. What a delight. Anthea is the Deputy Secretary at the newly formed Energy Group within the Victorian Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. The group is tasked with supporting current and future energy projects, programs and reforms, including strategic work to support major energy transformations. Anthea was the inaugural Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Climate Change Authority, established by the former Gillard government. Anthea has a depth of experience working in the intersection of economics and energy and is considered to be one of Australia's leading experts on emissions trading. Welcome, Anthea.
Good evening, everyone. It's a real joy to be here talking to a big group of people here to talk about climate change. And I'm very happy to be here to tell you that the Victorian government takes the issue of climate change extremely seriously and is actually taking a lot of action to try and deal with it. If I can have the next slide, please. So first of all, just to give you a bit of context, just where we're up to on the emissions front here in Victoria. So that picture on the left is a picture of where Victoria's emissions have been. Victoria has an emissions target for 2020 of between 15 and 20% below 2005 levels by 2020. And the good news is that we're on track to being in that range, and our current estimate is that we'll be 18.2% below 2005 levels by 2020. The picture on the right, it just shows you where our emissions come from. And about 90% of our emissions come from energy, probably unsurprisingly. And the makeup of that is about half of it comes from electricity generation. Of course, we still have 3 large coal-fired power stations here in Victoria. Direct combustion makes up about 18.5% of our emissions, so that's really burning largely gas here in Victoria. Transport accounts for just under 20%, and that has been rising in recent years. And fugitive emissions, which is things like gas leaking from pipelines and gas emitted during the production processes, is about 2.8%. The remainder is made up by agriculture, which is about 12.2%, so that's a significant emitting sector for Victoria. So that's essentially emissions from livestock and the use of fertiliser. Waste is fairly small at about 2.2%, and industrial process emissions are around 3.3%. So it's largely an energy story, although with some significant contributions from other sectors. If we go to the next slide, please. Now, Tom just set me up beautifully, thank you, Tom, for this slide. I'm not going to talk much about the potential risks that climate change poses for Victoria. Tom did a good outline of some of those big risks, but I'll just, one little snapshot, given today was such a warm and sunny day. If you like your warm and sunny days, you might be in luck in the future for Victoria. This is a picture of some work that CSIRO has done for us. This is in a high emissions scenario, which we do appear to be tracking towards globally. And it's showing what would happen to the number of hot days in a range of Victorian towns. And it's showing that most places, the number of hot days in an average year would double by 2050. So for Melbourne, between the period 1986 and 2005, you could expect on average about 6 days that would be over 35 degrees. In this scenario, by 2050, you could expect 13. If you're up in Mildura, you could expect to have, on average, 8 days over 40 degrees, and by 2050, you would expect 16 on average over 40. And if you're out in Bendigo, on average, you would have expected 4 days a year over 38 degrees, and that would rise to 10. So as I can see someone fanning themselves in the warm air today, that's just one little small snippet of some of the issues about climate change that we are trying to avoid. So next slide, please. So what is the government of Victoria doing about this? Well, first of all, I need to tell you about the Climate Change Act that we have here in Victoria, which really sets out a solid framework for how we think about and plan for climate change action here in this state. It's very closely modelled on the UK Climate Change Act, so if anyone's ever had any experience with that, which has been very successful in the UK, of really setting that foundational piece for action on climate change and really being a guiding framework for that country. So in our Climate Change Act, it enshrines the very important net zero emissions by 2050. That's tremendously important as an anchor for everything that we need to be thinking and doing. It needs to be on a transitional pathway towards that goal. So the Act enshrines a number of other really important things to make sure that we are on track. Importantly, it requires the government to set interim targets. Can't just say, oh, it's 2050, wave your hands, and then we'll worry about that in about 2049. You do need to have a plan. You do need to set interim targets along the way. It sets out some policy objectives and guiding principles, requires a climate change strategy. You're required to set up adaptation plans as well. You're required to set up sector pledges. I'll talk about those in a second. And there's arrangements for information and reporting back to the community so that everybody can see if we're on track or not. So in relation to these interim targets, they're required by law, and in fact, the next set of interim targets, getting out to 2030, the government must make a decision about what those interim targets should be by the 31st of March next year, so not very far away. And the government must make that decision public within 10 sitting days of Parliament. There's no choice about that. And it also needs to be informed by independent expert advice, and some of you may have seen that independent expert advice has been published. It was a report by a panel that was chaired by Greg Combay, and so that advice has been received and is being taken into account by government. Just a word on the sector pledge arrangements. There's actually 3 sets of pledges, and the pledges are really, so what are we going to do in terms of reducing emissions? That's what the pledges mean. First of all, there's a whole of government pledge. So numerically, government's emissions aren't that big in the grand scheme of things, but it's tremendously important for the government to show some leadership in its own activities in going about reducing emissions. So that's why the whole of a government pledge is important. The sector pledges are very important. So this is things like, so what is the plan for electricity? What is the plan for agriculture? What are those sector plans? So that needs to be set out. And there's also space there, a requirement for local government pledges as well. Next slide, please. So this is just a bit of a timeline of where we're up to on all of those processes. So the Climate Change Act here in Victoria was passed in 2017. The submissions from the public on the independent advice on targets was given to the government. Those submissions closed on the 22nd of July this year. As I said, the government's got until 31st of March next year to make decisions. And then the sector pledges, so that the story about what we're going to do in particular sectors to be on a track to meeting those targets, are due in August next year. Next slide, please. The next slide, this slide shows what the independent panel actually recommended. So the panel recommended that by 2030, that Victoria be 45 to 60% below 2005 levels by 2030. So, and the way that the panel talked about these targets, the 45% end, they really talked about as being something that would be a fair share for Victorian effort towards a 2-degree goal. They talked about the more ambitious end, the 60% end, as being something that would be give you a better chance of a 1.5 degree goal. They also did talk about that as something that would be it's something that with stronger federal action that would be something that you might want to be taking into account. Next slide, please. Now, what is the Victorian government already doing? So first of all, I want to talk to you about the Victorian Renewable Energy Target. The Victorian government has targets enshrined in legislation, and so there was a 25% target for 2020. We're on track to meet that. 40% target by 2025, and as of yesterday, the Victorian government passed legislation that now sets a 50% renewable energy target by 2030. Obviously, the Victorian Parliament clearly the Victorian Parliament had heard that there was a very important group meeting today and needed to hear some good news, and so they clearly thought that they'd better get on with it and pass it so that you could hear that news. In terms of achieving that target, this will be good news for Victorians. We estimate that when that target is achieved, it would result in reductions in average household bills of about $32 a year, about $3,100 for a medium-sized business, and about $150,000 for a large business. We also estimate that it would create about 24,000 jobs. In terms of what the Victorian government has already done, its very successful VRET option, so its Victorian Renewable Energy Target auctions, was successful. 6 projects were successful in that auction, adding up to 928 megawatts of new wind and solar capacity for Victoria. The government has another range of contracts that it entered into under what's called the Renewable Certificate Purchasing Initiative. So there were 4 projects adding up to another 351 megawatts of renewable energy. And finally, I should highlight that the government has invested in large-scale battery storage, which is kind of the new kid on the technology block here in Australia, in energy land. And that's added up to 55 megawatts or 80 megawatt hours of storage that's been added to our system. Next slide, please. Another really significant program that the government of Victoria has is the Solar Homes program. So the Solar Homes program is a $1.3 billion program over 10 years. And the program will lead to 650,000 extra households in Victoria having PV on their roofs, 50,000 extra on top of that for landlords and renters, which has always been a problem about, who's going to pay, all of those sorts of things. 10,000 battery storage systems, which can play a very important role in a world as we're moving more and more to more renewable energy targets. We know storage will be part of that story. 60,000 solar hot water systems, and we estimate that this will create 5,500 jobs. For those who have solar PV on their roof through this scheme, we estimate that it would save them on average $890 per year on their bills. Okay, next slide please. Just wanted to highlight that every time you hop on a tram, all the electricity used by that tram is completely offset by the use of renewable energy certificates that the Victorian Government has purchased under new projects that it has commissioned. So some of 35 megawatts of the projects that I mentioned before are dedicated to backing the energy used by your tram system. We estimate that will save more than 80,000 tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions per year. Next slide, please. Another program that I want to highlight, this one's been around for a while, it's probably the quiet achiever of the group, but it actually is an important scheme. It's called the Victorian Energy Upgrade Scheme. It's what's known as a white certificate scheme, if anyone's ever heard that term. What it does is it creates incentives for all kinds of energy efficiency activities. And through a certificate scheme, retailers are obliged to buy these certificates, which gives them a value. And there's all sorts of activities that can be undertaken that are eligible to create these certificates that gives an incentive for these activities. So it's all sorts of things like lighting. Lighting's been very popular lately. More efficient shower heads, heating and cooling, gas efficiency, refrigeration. There's hundreds of different methodologies for being able to create these energy efficiency certificates. And so it's a wonderful way of being able to shine a spotlight on different energy efficiency activities and opportunities, and to really make sure that there's an incentive there for people to get on and undertake those activities. So since 2009, when the scheme started, 1.8 million households have benefited from activities under the scheme, and so have 100,000 businesses since that time. It's contributed over the life of the scheme to over $3 billion in total bill savings, and it's contributed 52 million tonnes of greenhouse gas emission savings since that time. As I said, it really is the quiet achiever in the greenhouse gas abatement world. Now finally, I just wanted to give a very small snippet of some of the activities that the Victorian Government is undertaking in the field of adaptation. So first of all, in relation to the water sector, the Victorian Government has the Victorian Water and Climate Initiative, and that's really about getting a much better information base so that we know what we're dealing with when we're talking about the impacts of climate change on water systems. There's a project undertaken with the University of Melbourne to understand where runoff rates across Victoria have reduced. There's a project with the Bureau of Meteorology to really understand how different weather types influence rainfall, and if you've ever spoken to a climate scientist of any stripe, they'll always, when you talk about rainfall, they always say that's the hardest bit in terms of trying to predict, because it's quite variable naturally, and so that's obviously of tremendous importance, so trying to get more information about that. And another project with the CSIRO to improve methods for generating rainfall and stream flow projections for Victoria, so we can really have a better handle on what we might be expecting in terms of inflows. Another couple of things to highlight. The Victorian Government is working with the CSIRO to carry out a coastal hazard assessment for Port Phillip Bay. And that's going to be looking at things like likely impacts of inundation, so flooding, groundwater change, and things like erosion. It's going to be having a lot of data and doing a lot of analysis to make sure that we can properly understand for the Port Phillip Bay area what we might be dealing with in terms of coastal impacts. And finally, one that I wanted to highlight was a program called Supporting Our Regions to Adapt, which is really promoting community engagement. So it's partnering with local community groups around Victoria and to really foster kind of collaboration between state, local governments and regional stakeholders for them to be thinking about their own climate risks, their own adaptation challenges and what they want to be doing about those challenges. So rather than a very top-down state telling everyone what needs to be done, it's really trying to capture those local insights and local learnings and give people an opportunity to be involved. Thank you very much.
I'm going to wait and check this time. I can move confidently. Thank you very much, Anthea. Peter Newman, who you have already heard a little bit about, is a Distinguished Professor of Sustainability at Curtin University's Sustainability Policy Institute in Western Australia and the Coordinating Lead Author for the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for Transport. Peter works with all levels of government in local, national and international contexts to promote the use of sustainability data to help cities operate efficiently. Peter was recognised as WA Scientist of the Year in 2018, having previously worked as an elected local councillor, an advisor to 3 premiers, and having served on the board of Infrastructure Australia and the Prime Minister's Cities Reference Group. And when not thinking about how to make our cities more sustainable, Peter likes to play with his grandchildren and is currently renovating an 1870s house in Fremantle very sustainably. Thank you, Peter.
Well, there's a lot of questions coming in, so don't know how we'll get through all of them, but thanks very much, and it's delightful to be here. The picture that Tom has presented of the global change that could happen is pretty scary, very costly, and the need to act is there. And Anthea has given us an idea of what a state government can do, but it is a transition. There's no doubt that we have to act quickly, but this transition is what I've been part of for 20 or 30 years. I know the climate emergency saying we've got to start doing something. Well, we have started. There's an awful lot that's happened. If we can see the first slide. The decoupling of GDP or GNI, this is GNI, gross national income, which is a bit better way to measure wealth, but it is decoupling. We now are learning how to grow our economies, create opportunities, pay for health and education, do all the things that economic activity is about. We are learning how to do that without fossil fuels. And that journey has been happening since the 1990s, but it's really accelerated this century. I'm in all kinds of global international groups now. The IPCC is the biggest one, but I've just come back from Hanoi today, where we had a UN workshop of 25 Asian nations, not Australia, but the Asian nations, the big ones that are, China and India and all, the ones that, more than half the world, and they have big problems in transport. And this group is committed to environmentally sustainable transport, the EST. They started that process 10 years ago. They got together, the governments, and said, we got to do something. They set targets and indicators, boring stuff that bureaucrats have to do, right, Anthea? And that kind of story you saw there with targets and indicators and pledges, they come about because people sit down and talk and write stuff and then take it to politicians, and the pressure is on to try and do something. Well, yesterday I discovered that the ADB, who are the Asian Development Bank, they finance transport. In that 10-year period, the finance going to roads has gone from 91% in 2010 to this year 45%. And they were saying, now this is not due to us, it's due to the pressure coming from these countries to solve their problems, to create electric transport, public transport systems. And I thought, well, you know, that's progress. That's 10 years with the big places that need to do something. They are getting on and doing it too. It's not just the Victorian government doing their little bit here. It is actually happening on a global stage. And you can start to see it, that it's actually manageable. It isn't totally out of control. We are beginning a transition that is manageable. Next one. Now, in Australia, we have also shown how to do this decoupling. The growth in our economy has happened whilst coal and oil have plateaued. In fact, coal has been going down now for nearly 7 years. We still export a lot, but consumption is going down. So we are learning, we are working out how to do it. It's clearly not fast enough. But transitions are often like this. In the early stages, as you start going over the top, it's harder, and then you go down the other side rapidly because you now know it's not so hard. In fact, it's better. Next one. Even a place like Bhutan, very poor country, it's very beautiful, and it's got lots of things going for it, but they are decoupling as well. In fact, they're already carbon neutral. Next one. And they have this gross national happiness index. They try to show that they can do gross national happiness increasing, gross domestic product increasing, and their greenhouse gas going down at the same time. That's our transition that we're all trying to do. Next. Now, there's a lot of theory about how you do this transition, and mostly it's about how you start in little niches down the bottom, and it slowly sort of coalesces. You get more and more local governments and industries working together until it's a whole landscape. But that process of change can be accelerated, but it is a process that takes time. Next one. And over the last 200 years, we've had 5 other major transitions as we've shifted from wood into steam power based on coal, and then the oil wave, and now we're going through this wave of the superhighway and the digital transition. And the sustainability transition is coming out of it. You can see that these waves are getting narrower. In other words, they're happening quicker. And they're all driven by different factors. But what I want to talk about tonight is, okay, we've got governments obviously have to play a role. They have to regulate, they have to set targets and do all that. And we're doing some of that. Industry have to play a role, but so do you. And what is your role? Because it's so critical to understand how important that role is. Next one. This is a new book that's come out. It's called This Life, Secular Faith and Spiritual Freedom, by a person who's not a religious person, but he's saying most of the major things that we've gained, like the 8 hours work, 8 hours rest, 8 hours recreation, sleep, recreation, you know the story. That was a fight in the 19th century, during the middle of the Industrial Revolution. But the communities worked on that vision at that time. We take it all for granted now. But that became part of that transition. It was a vision set by communities, by civil society groups, by unions. And that was, he says, like a secular faith. And he also says the fight to stop climate change is really a situation requiring a secular faith. So secular faith believers here tonight, good on you. This is what it's about. Next one. And there are lots of these visions that are happening. We've got zero carbon everything, circular economy, shared economy, biophilic urbanism, retro suburbia, regenerative cities. All of them are about hope for our cities and communities and settlements. Next one. So there are even new visions for mining. Now, I was on Virginia Trioli yesterday from Hanoi because she had discovered that we were now exporting lithium to the world. You didn't see me, I'm waving at you at the back. Because she'd read this article in the Financial Times, which was saying, we are producing the elements that are needed for batteries. Lithium, cobalt, manganese, vanadium, all of these elements. They come from Western Australia, my state, because we've got a very old rocks that are heavily exposed. It's easy to mine. And we've got now 8 lithium mines. We produce most of the world's lithium. And they are being transformed into value-added products for the first time. We're doing that. And that kind of vision, next one, is what we've called Lithium Valley. Because you can see on the left there is the Australian, we lead the world in terms of resources in this area. The interesting thing for me, having spent a lot of time with mining companies, and they're not always doing the right thing, they are unbelievably committed to this vision of providing the world with an ethically and transparently available product. It's going to have blockchain doping on everything so that you can trace it through and recycle it and so on. And they're very committed to this idea. So that's a secular faith. It is about not just doing something to make money, but it is actually creating a better world. And they want to be part of the solution. And it's such a relief to see them enjoying that. Next one. So the main thing is we're going to win or lose this in our cities. Next. You're supposed to look at me so I can wave at you. All right. This is the book which I have here in my hand. It's called Resilient Cities, Overcoming Fossil Fuel Dependence. And I've got 2 copies here. I want to give them away to the best 2 questions tonight. One online and anyone else here who can ask a question. But it does summarise a lot of this that I'm talking about. And if you want to get one, I've got a bit of paper here you can fill in and I'll send you one. So he's not looking at me again. I'm going to quickly run through some of the vision that is really a secular faith that is coming through in the work that we do. This is Josh Burns' house. Josh set this house up. You know Josh, he's on Gardening Australia tomorrow night at 7:30. He works full-time for me. He just does that in his part-time. But the house that he built was designed to show the world you can make something fossil fuel free and that it works for a family. And it does beautifully. I'll just quickly run through these. So he's got the induction cooker, he's got a heat pump here, he's got an electric vehicle, he's got batteries and PV on the roof. And next, the economics of it are, he's laughing after 9 years, and he's about halfway there now. But it's going to pay off, and he'll be completely free then of the cost of that, doing that. Now that's really a symbol of what the world needs to do, isn't it? There's a bit of pain, and then you can do it. He's also got to work with a whole series of project home developers and shown them they can do it too. Next one. And he's shown that will pay off after 6 years. Now, many of you have done this in your own home, and it is something that Australians are doing. We are getting on and fixing our own homes. Next one. And we've also shown that you can do it with medium density developments. So it's this White Gum Valley project is demonstrating 100 units of development that are completely carbon positive, exporting more renewables to the grid, and they are sharing it, next one, using blockchain. And blockchain is a new way of sharing trusted information. This is a social housing project, and it's all part of it. So we know how to do it in our cities. There's no question about it. We've got to just mainstream it and keep the vision going. Next. There's beautiful additions to doing this as well, making the open space work well. And the next phase is going to do 1,000 units, and after that another 10,000 units. Now, government is behind this, but not driving it. It is, in fact, the private sector, and they're showing that it sells. It is, in fact, easy. Next one. Now, transport wasn't a lot in the strategy on transport, I noticed. And it is harder, but I'd have to say we've got to do it. We cannot just let oil continue to increase while we fix up coal. No, it's not. We've got to get on with that. And it's mostly about electrify, electrify, electrify. We can do it in all of forms of transport. It's going to be a bit harder on shipping and aviation, but we're going to have to continue to work on that. But in our cities, it's absolutely no reason why we can't do it. Let me just show you this. Come on, press it. This is why I need them. It is electric, it can be recharged at stations in a fully solar way. It's an extraordinary vehicle, but it's a tenth of the price of a light car. Now this is a major breakthrough, and I would predict that hundreds of cities are rapidly going to demonstrate this. So this is the kind of thing that's going to be happening. See, it's smart, isn't it? It's smart. It's using that kind of smart technology, but it's not just saying, oh, we're going to have autonomous vehicles all over the city and they're just going to be running around looking for people. This is actually something that you can imagine will improve our cities. So we've got local governments all across Australia working with us now, and the City of Wyndham want to put one of these in down at Point Cook, and we'll be working with them tomorrow. The City of Liverpool in Sydney have got a whole new vision for how they want to push trackless tram out to the new Western Sydney Airport. So these visions are what drive change. Industry can do it, governments can back it, but without the vision, you don't get anywhere. Next one. Other visions are things like density visions can be done in, like, Singapore's amazing biophilic urbanism. It's worth going just to see this. Next one. We've got David Holmgren's amazing retro suburbia, which certainly fits in some parts of the city and needs, it's a better vision than the 1950s, as he's put there. Next one. It's an extraordinary journal, this Renew. If you don't get Renew, it's just beautiful the way it sets out ordinary Australians doing extraordinary things in their houses, their transport, their waste, and it's amazing visions. Secular faith, I call it. Next one. The Sharing Cities vision, which is a lot of this is happening in Melbourne. This is a book that was written from a Melbourne guy. Next one. And this Australian film, which is done very well on regenerating cities. So there are positive things you can take, hopeful things you can take. Next one. And Lighter Footprints. What an organisation. I don't know anything quite like it. It's just amazing how it is creating this future for us. And that is the kind of thing that politicians, sitting down the front row, and others, industry people, businesses, they listen, they see what's happening, and they say, let's get on and do this. Next one. Final thing, secular faith. I actually go to a church, and one of the things that I've learnt about, when you read the book of Revelation, it's an amazing thing. There's this guy sitting on an island as Rome is collapsing, having visions about the future. And he sees two kinds of cities in the future. The first one, it's about frivolous consumption, and it is doomed. It is going to collapse. And the next is a city of diamonds. What the heck is that? In theology and philosophy, diamonds are about the long-term legacy that people leave through their work. It is about what we do to create that future in our cities. So you build the city with your diamonds fitting together. They represent us, and the stories of hope are your diamonds that you build and create the future with. And it's so important that we keep doing that. Don't give up with despair and say it's all over. We can do it. These are my grandchildren, and they will be around in 2050 when those kind of targets have to be completed. And this is why I think we can do it this way, if you see the final one, which is that you can continue to create economic opportunity. The CO2 can disappear because renewables will keep growing. Coal will go first, then oil, then gas. There is no need for nuclear. We can do it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Peter. I will invite our other speakers to come up and join us here on the stage. Peter dropped a little hint there before. I also do want to acknowledge that we are joined here today by the local member, John Kennedy, for the electorate of Hawthorn. Thank you very much for joining us. And just to really acknowledge as well that Anthea raised this point earlier, but that yesterday the Victorian government legislation that did pass the renewable energy target of 50% by 2030, it's just an astounding step forward from where we have been, and congratulate you on that outcome. So thank you. Thank you all for your questions as well. I've been watching as they've come through. Before I told you that I will be using my phone, which is how I'll be looking at the questions, so I'm not just distracted and, texting updates on and whatnot. I told you before we wouldn't be answering them all. There's 92 questions. I lied. We're locking the doors. You're in for the whole evening. So let's go. Before I do focus in though, and there are a couple of themes that have come up quite a lot, what I've just heard here is urgency, a dire future if we don't do anything, really clear examples of what that could look like, but also a lot of inspirational hope around what is possible and the momentum that is already out there. But I also know the reality that we all live in is that this is hard work and it is deeply frustrating when you have been working on this for an extended period of time and you've seen the highs and lows. I know many of our audience have been through that process as well, perhaps not as intimately as you three may have, but where does your motivation to work on this come from? And Peter, you might have just hinted at that with your last slide, but this is deeply personal work at the same time. It's not just figures on a slide. Where is that motivation coming from? There's a switch.
No. Ooh. Yeah, I think you got a pretty clear idea that my grandchildren make a big difference to me now. And I dare say a lot of you have grandchildren, you think, these numbers that Tom's giving us here, 2050, that's in their lifetime. And you really wonder what kind of world you're creating for them. But that is important. But I have always felt that we could do things ourselves, and so in our family we've always had a sense that we can live simpler, but we can also contribute globally, and that notion sometimes means you have to get in jumbo jets and travel the world, consuming a lot of fossil fuels. But if you're working towards that transition constantly, then it becomes meaningful and you can create a good life. And I don't think it's damaged my children to be part of that transition, and I certainly believe they are contributing to it. Yeah, push it up. Yeah.
Okay, is that working now? Yes, we are. Besides just outright stubbornness to continue on in the field for quite some time, I think it's wonderful working in the public service. Often public servants get a bit of a bad rap, but you scratch the surface of most public servants and they really are there because they want to make a difference to their communities. And the people I'm working with right now in energy in particular can see this transition to a better energy future, a cleaner energy future that's going to deliver better outcomes for the Victorian community, and that's what we're trying to achieve.
Oh, good. My motivation's quite clear. I think economists have been part of the problem. I think many of us, including the famous Nordhaus model, have generated damages that are far too small. And when you look at those sorts of models and you say, well, the potential damages in 2100 might be 2 or 3% of GDP, no one cares. Economists don't care, environmental economists don't care, because it's relatively small. Everything's growing. So of course you take a little slice out of GDP, well, we can live with that. The problem is that they're not being measured correctly. So I've been on this mission to try and generate credible measures of damages and compare them to the cost of emissions reduction. So you can make this sort of decision. I mean, treasuries want to know what the benefits relative to the costs are. And if you can't give them that number, it's hard to make a case. But yeah, I find economics quite frustrating. And even though I'm an economist, and I think it's time we do better. And I'm trying to help that.
Thank you all. We are seeing action, though, in some places already. And the top question that has come in for tonight, Anthea, you spoke really compellingly about the work that the Victorian government is doing. And as someone who worked as a campaigner, campaigning for a state-based organisation for a previous Victorian government to work on climate change, it is certainly very heartening to see that real shift. It does change the dynamics in the Australian context, though. We haven't seen another state government be quite as forward-focused as this. And so the question is, can the states make the transition without the federal government?
A lot of things that states can do, are doing, or by themselves. There are some things where it would be awfully helpful for the Commonwealth Government to actually do, where it does make sense for things to be led nationally. I think prime, really good example of that would be vehicle emission standards. So I think we're one of the few countries, not just in the developed world, but the world, that doesn't have emission standards for vehicles. So which is quite extraordinary. So customers are paying for it. We're driving around and are being offered less efficient vehicles than in other parts of the world. Driving more efficient vehicles saves people money. We should be promoting through kind of that sort of system electric vehicles as part of what should be a growing share of the vehicle fleet, but we haven't seen that. So Victoria, along with other states, are very keen for that to happen. So that's, I think, just one example where that's difficult for states to do those sorts of things. There are some things that really do make sense to be done at a national level.
But you can begin that process. California certainly has set the world up with a lot of things to do with vehicles and their emissions, because they had a problem and they said, we're going to do this, and then everyone's followed. But you can help get things going there. And the vehicle emissions work that happened when we got rid of lead, the states basically led that. The federal government caved in the end. And we ended up, it was easy, the transition. Once the regulations were set, I don't think we should avoid the regulations being set by someone and then everyone will follow. But let me just say, I don't think it's just up to the states or the federal government. It does mean that industry can get on and do these things. They can help with the electrification of vehicles and getting them into the market cheaper and easier before we have to be told to do it. We can get things happening, and in our state we have no Climate Change Act. We're working on one. It's now out for public view, but the idea of getting solar into your household, we have been one of the world leaders on it, not because there was any government program, but because ordinary folks like you guys got out and did it. We had a boom. People took their new money and put it on the roof. With those 30% of households now have PVs, and local small businesses, about 35 of them, got that whole process going so you could put it in, permitted and financed in 24 hours and at half the price of what you could do in America. That was an effort of ordinary households and small business. 30% of households, that means that over 1,000 megawatts. That's the biggest power station in Western Australia now. Not planned.
Yeah, absolutely. Tom, what do you see in this question of responsibility, and how, when there might be blockages in some places, how other agencies, players can step in to fill those vacuums?
Well, Australia is still, I'm from Chicago, but I've been here for about a decade. But it's still a puzzle for me here. We subsidize fossil fuels.
Puzzle for some of us too.
Yeah, we subsidize, absolutely. We subsidize fossil fuel companies in this country by the rate of $5.5 billion a year. Globally, it's $5 trillion. Well, why do we do that? Why do we subsidize fossil fuels? Shouldn't be done. So I'm going to say something that may get me kicked out of the room, but remember, I'm an economist. We like to tax bad things and subsidize good things. So we should be subsidizing renewable energy, not fossil fuels. And good grief, maybe we should even have a price on carbon again.
Yeah.
Did you catch my last point on a price on carbon? Ah, good on you. And you applauded that. Fantastic, fantastic. I mean, we put taxes on bad things like alcohol and cigarettes and all kinds of things, but no, not on pollution. Come on, it's time to do it. And it worked. Andrea, right? It worked.
I think Andrea wears some particular battle scars from that round of Australian climate politics. Another question, I guess, speaking to where is Australia's ambition in this transformation. The head of ARENA recently said that Australia could have over 700% renewables. Can we really get to that amount and have a value-added export economy for renewable energy?
There's been huge amounts of interest and excitement around being able to really go well beyond 100% renewables and using that extra renewable supply to be able to create hydrogen, both for use here domestically, but as a really potentially large export opportunity. So that's something that actually the federal government and the states and territories are all interested in working on. There's a national hydrogen strategy that the COAG Energy Council will be considering before the end of the year. So there's certainly lots of interest. Australia has got absolutely spectacular renewable energy resources, so from that perspective, if anyone was going to do it, there's certainly no reason why Australia wouldn't.
Yeah, there is a company that's setting up a project to collect renewable energy, turn it into hydrogen, and export to Asia through that top end from the Pilbara, and even to make electricity that could be in a submarine cable using HVDC to make it over long distance. So those projects are available around. They could happen quite quickly if the economics of it turns that way. It's not, and the politics, of course. So, Tom, over to you. Yeah. Will it happen?
Yeah. So my good friends up at ANU tell me that 200% is possible. 100% should be easy. I'm not sure about 700%. But there's a little bit of a catch here. You have to be a bit careful. Globally, the percentage of renewables in energy demand have been increasing, but so have emissions. Why is that? Well, we still have a lot of economic growth in the world and a lot of population growth, and if we don't change that balance considerably, emissions still rise. You have to do this quickly. You can't just wait.
Well, I'm interested that you make that point because I've got to say I'm still reeling from your presentation earlier talking about the scale of loss and damage that we will be facing around the world. And it's not just a will be in a future sense, it's a very much a here and now for many communities, including some in Australia, which we forget about rather conveniently and rapidly. But you made a comment, what you were talking about, 26% loss of GDP. And your comment, Tom, was... and it was just a throwaway, so I'm just picking up here. But you sort of turned to the audience and said, I mean, you can imagine what that means. I actually don't think I can imagine what that means. I think that's actually, we're talking about a scale of impact that's probably beyond any of certainly beyond our lived experience and beyond what seems fathomable in a normal civilization. How do we go about holding the realities of that research and actually being able to use that to plan and prepare, because it's quite a disjunct from our daily existence.
Well, you can imagine that your income falls by 28% or 26%. Just take 28% out of your income. How does that look?
I mean, look, just to pick that up, to be frank, I exist on a probably above average income, and we are in an electorate and a community where the majority of people here live above the Australian average. So it would impact us, but not in the way it will impact many other people in our communities. And how do we see that through a lens that recognises the diverse impacts that's going to wear?
Yeah, so on average, it's not just your income, it's everyone's income in that particular country that will suffer a 28% loss. That's devastating, because when their incomes fall, they buy less goods and services, demands for things fall generally, tax revenues fall, so government can't fund things it wants to do. And in particular, those countries with the major falls are the ones that really can't afford it. I mean, they're the ones who really do suffer.
And what happens when a country goes through that kind of, it's not really just it becomes no longer just an economic issue, is it?
Well, I mean, we don't really know in a sense, because we haven't experienced that sort of fall in GDP. But of course, it must be catastrophic, right? Tremendous falls in income from people who are just barely above the poverty line. There will be a lot of suffering. It's a worry. It's a problem.
These themes of equity and consideration across communities is something that comes up through the CANA membership quite a lot, from a range of different organisations. And interestingly, when I was hearing of just the themes across the presentations, we're talking about a lot of industry-led transformation, and how do we make sure that this transformation doesn't leave people behind, that we actually bring the whole of a community with us?
Let me say one more word before that. I mean, I saw some of the questions in the online forum. And I get this when I go into the Department of Energy and Environment as well. We all say that Australia is a small player, right? It doesn't have much emissions compared to the rest of the world, not counting the fact that we export a lot of fossil fuels. Leave that aside for a moment. So why should Australia act? It's a very small player. Why should we act? Well, you could say it's a moral responsibility, but if we're not acting, why would you expect poor countries where populations are just above the poverty line to take cuts in their emissions? You wouldn't expect it, right? So, sorry, and I totally ignored your question, but I wanted to make that point, because I get this all the time. It's time for us to take some moral leadership on this issue and not duck it.
Not at all, not at all. A very important point, so thank you. The question was, in this transformation, how do we make sure that we're not leaving people behind, that we're bringing the whole of the community with us?
Well, it's absolutely essential that we do it that way, a just transition and climate resilient development still means that you need development that can create jobs, and these need to be constantly being created. And that was the good thing about Andrea's analysis that you gave with the numbers of jobs that are being created through this strategy. It is not hair-shirting our way to the future. There will be change, but there will be creating jobs, and those jobs we need to train for, and we need to ensure that it is something that is available for everybody. And Indigenous communities in particular can be playing a significant role in this, particularly in this carbon reduction processes in remote and rural areas. There's all kinds of visionary things that can be happening and bringing people with us. Certainly, we can easily do eco-housing that's very expensive, or we can make it very accessible and affordable. And we know how to do both. We just have to make sure that the targets not just say 0 by 2050, but 0 by 2050 plus a greater equity in how we make our money through that time. That there does need, and we do need help from economists on this. Really, we do need these sort of targets that can incorporate employment at various income levels and how that is distributed. That's the kind of thing I'd like to see next.
Andrea, you're sitting in a policy-making space at the moment. How is the Victorian government grappling with this issue?
actually a lot of ways that we try and think about these things. And I would like to say I don't think it's one of those issues that's always difficult, and I don't think you can ever sit, and think your job is done now, right? We've done that, or we can stop now. It's a constant thing that you have to try and think what's the next wave, how we can try and get community engagement, involvement, buy-in, and to make sure that people don't get left behind in the energy transition. And that's a whole range of types of approaches and techniques and programs and all sorts of things. So it's everything from really trying to make sure that we're tapping into what community groups want to do, making sure that we engage groups and make sure that there's support for and scaffolding around bottom-up kinds of activities and the things that local communities themselves want to be able to do, right through to making sure that some of our energy efficiency programs, we've got an affordable retrofits program, for example, going on at the moment, specifically designed to make sure that for very low income disadvantaged people who just the upfront capital cost of getting the new fridge or the insulation or all the sorts of things that would make their environment not only a heck of a lot more comfortable and if you've got health impacts and things, and living in a more a comfortable insulated house, for example, and with appliances that are cheaper to run, most important, for low-income people, to make this, that's one example of a program that's trying to do those things. So it's a whole range of activities that are going on. Another example is the renters component in the solar homes program, to make sure that it's not just people who own their own homes, which has overwhelmingly been where solar has been rolled out to date, to make sure that there's a component that we can make sure that renters can get the advantage of those lower bills as well and feel part of that energy transformation. So it's not one thing, it's a lot of things.
Thank you. I guess if we turn our attention from this grand global transformation, that we then need to see action at a national level and at a state level, but also at a local level. Peter, you talk about cities-based transformation and the diamonds that we need to find there. Where are the diamonds in Kooyong? What's the opportunity here? You know this area, you've been visiting this area over a period of time. Where do you see the biggest opportunity for that city-scale transformation in Kooyong?
I wouldn't have picked Kooyong because I'm working out at Wyndham where there's a good deal less income, and the people there are still struggling because they don't have adequate public transport, and there are real needs for local services to be built up and so on. So there's a lot of diamonds being created by groups and local government councillors and local government officers who are creating opportunities for a different future, a future that they would be proud of, and which that is going to be far less consuming of fossil fuels. It's written into everything they're doing. Now, I'm sure there are things like that are going on in Kooyong, a lot of them hidden, and I'm not necessarily saying that the diamonds are always seen. Diamonds are subtle. They last for generations. They are beautiful. They are handcrafted. They are put together with raw materials, but they are turned into something of beauty. And often they are not seen. So I'm sure there are a lot of people who could tell some stories here better than I could about what's going on in Kooyong.
One of the things that you have all alluded to is the role of the built environment, and it's coming up a lot in the questions tonight, around the role of either stronger standards or the need to transform given that just the sheer quantity of emissions that are across the built environment. Where do you see the biggest opportunities for change there that we're not currently already taking action on?
The biggest thing is in the transport area, because that is out of control still. Mostly, we know what to do with light vehicles, and we know what to do in our homes and businesses about greater efficiency, renewable energy, and batteries that can be established around grids to enable a just transition, a clean transition. We can make that 2050. It's imaginable now. But the transition with trucks, buses need to be part of that as well. Larger, heavier vehicles, and then into the shipping and aviation area, which, because they're international, they got away with blue murder. Nobody's manages them. And they're just quietly working away saying, oh, we're getting a bit more efficient. But they're growing at such a rate that is the thing that is totally out of control. And it is not clear what it is they have to do. So it's hard to regulate them. But we at least have got to get systems together where government controls can be imposed on them. At the moment, they're run by an NGO, both of them.
Tom, what are you seeing in that space?
Yeah, so Andrea mentioned emission standards, which is really, quite an important part of the solution. It's very poor here, not good. But before I would get to the built environment, I would start thinking about land clearing in Australia. We have horrendous land clearing here, and so. And I live
Not in Victoria.
Yeah, not in Victoria, Queensland in particular.
Well,
maybe.
Andrea, you may have jumped the gun on the next question.
Okay, so that's what I would start looking at. I live in South Bank, which barely has a tree. So it's time to get serious about land clearing. And then Peter's quite right. The transport sector is the real bottleneck in Australia, I think.
In the world.
Yeah, in the world, but yeah, quite right. We need to take some really hard steps there. And one good thing would be a price on carbon, right? But that would transition to electric vehicles quite nicely. And indeed, the government revenues we get from that could be used to compensate people who are less well off than you and I. We wouldn't use the scheme they used in France, for example, because that just creates riots in the street. And would also generate extra funds for subsidies of renewables. We know the solutions. The question is, why aren't we doing them?
Let's come to that question in a moment. I am going to pick up the forestry comment, Andrea, because it has come up through the questions a couple of times tonight. Why is the Victorian government still allowing old growth logging when we know how important those ecosystems are? And in East Gippsland in particular, some of those ecosystems have been found to be the most carbon-dense forests on the planet.
And I'm afraid I'm going to squib that horribly on the basis that it really is not my field of expertise, and I wouldn't want to give an incorrect answer. And I feel bad squibbing that, but I wouldn't want to give anything that was inaccurate.
I respect that and understand that's not your area. I do think, and I appreciate you raising it, Tom, it's a really interesting question, and just acknowledge it is one that has come up, and it might be one that our local member is particularly interested to note how important it's been to this community that's still going on in Victoria.
Can I just say that there's still only one part of Australia that's banned the logging of old-growth forests, and that's in the Wild West. And that happened because of a massive grassroots campaign led by people like you, but it took off when Mick Malthouse joined the campaign and said he supported this, and all of a sudden it became very popular. It was 92% support across the whole community, and it changed an election. So you can win these things. You won't get it by just waiting for government. It has to be a campaign.
And it has to be backed by football stars. That's the message you're bringing to Victoria. Thank you so much, Peter. All right. Look, my last question is coming back to this this theme of responsibility and whose job it is to act. We know that there's an international need for action, a federal need, state-based need. We've heard about the roles of cities, but we are sitting in a room with a powerful group of people who all have networks, skills, abilities, histories, ways of creating change. What is your sort of message or request or ask to this room for taking action and actually making what we've heard tonight, the positive version of what we've heard tonight, the reality of our future?
You're looking at me. Look, I think lighter footprints is exactly the model for how the world gets changed. We need people who are committed to meeting, talking through, setting visions, bringing people together and saying, this is what we want. Now, I think that the climate rebellion people are doing amazing stuff in putting on the agenda the climate issue. I think it is a pity when it becomes violent, but that I'm sure wasn't them. There are others who always come in and seem to do that at these events. But it is gathering momentum worldwide that grassroots movements are happening to demand greater action. But I think it needs to be translated into real policy directions that can be pushed with governments. And that's the kind of thing that Lighter Footprints have done and actually changed the political agenda frequently. And I think that the world can learn from that.
I really do think that everybody has a role to play, from individuals in their own decisions, their own modes of transport, the way they live their lives, but also in their advocacy and in their engagement with other processes. And that's with government processes, of course. As a public servant, I work for you, and we rely on that engagement to make sure that we need to be in touch with what communities expect of us. So that's something that's welcomed and encouraged and is a necessary part of making sure that we can make transformational change. And also with businesses, we can see huge change. Over the last 15 years, it's just been a huge change in attitudes of so many big corporates through to much smaller businesses in the way that they think about how they go about their business and their attitudes to things like renewable energy is just one very small example. So I think there's a lot of change that happens, and all of those changes are made when individuals get together and think about things and make them happen. So it's definitely not the case that everybody can lie back and worry about what happens in Canberra and that's the end of that. There's a lot of optimism, and that actually the actions of groups like Lighter Footprints, they do matter.
So I think it's a maxim that governments don't lead, they follow. Victorian government maybe is an exception, but and there's some aspects that are certainly the case in Victoria. It's really a standout. But generally, the federal government here doesn't lead. It will only follow. And it's nice to have all these hopeful messages, and I really do appreciate that. But I think we got to get mad. We got to get angry. We've got to do it at the ballot box. We got to do it. We have to do it at the ballot box. Yeah, we tried. No. Maybe we got to go down to the Melbourne Convention Centre and get bounced around by police on horses. And thank God the kids are doing things like that. But the longer we wait, the worse it will be. There's a real inertia in the climate. If you don't cut emissions quickly, it'll be trouble, and it'll be expensive, and for some places catastrophic. So we got to get out there. Got to have these forums. Got to get mad. Got to get going.
That certainly resonates with me and my background in advocacy and campaigning, in having to push and drive to get these sorts of outcomes. But one of the things I think we are also seeing right across the community and a range of different sectors is a really widespread recognition that it's no longer enough just to call for someone else to take action. We will own this future and we will own this transformation ourselves, and the decisions that we all make as small business owners, as customers who go and spend our money and where we choose to put it in every decision we are making, in the networks we're keeping, will actually be creating and making this transformation. So I guess the piece I want to sort of add in there, taking what I've heard here tonight, is the challenge to this room perhaps is to find your diamonds for Kooyong and work out what it is that you bring and how you make this transformation possible here. So I'm going to leave that with you to think about for this evening. I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking all of our panellists, Peter, Anthea and Tom. I'm about to hand back to Carolyn to close us out for the evening, but I also do just want to, on behalf of the panel and behalf of the audience, thank you as well, Carolyn. Lighter Footprints is a phenomenal organisation, perhaps even one of your local diamonds, but Carolyn is certainly a fabulous leader of this group, and we are here because of your efforts, so thank you.
I think they're fantastic, and I'm a bit overwhelmed by all of the stuff that we've heard tonight. We've got a little diamond here, which is a bottle of wind wine, and I just want to pass it over to them, and I'll hand you this bag, and you can do that for me. Thank you, guys. While we just wrap up the last few minutes that we've got together, clearly this is... Lighter Footprints is, in fact, a small organisation. There's just a handful of people who do a lot of hard work. And I'm really, really lucky to be part of this organisation. It's extraordinary to have people of like mind who can work together and achieve things the way that we do. However, we are small, and you are our choir that goes out from here with this message. We can only provide you with that kind of information and access. We've been able to secure people like this because you come, because you're part of a groundswell that is growing in this community, and we want to foster that as much as possible. And that's why we've collected as much information as we can, and we're going to have it on the website. We've got our videos here, we've gone Facebook Live, we've been Twittering tonight, and all of that is helping to raise the issues that you've heard. So amazingly eloquently put, was really listenable. I guess the one thing I would like to say is that one of the things that we in Lighter Footprints have done since our inception is say that the issue is above politics and that all parties need to be involved in dealing with this. And so we do still talk to all of our parties, and we believe that you, in your way, should be doing the same with people who believe and don't believe. Bring your secular faith and talk to everybody. In our view, we pressure as many as we can in our own local area, and we will continue to do that and ask you to help us to do that. We've got tonight, before you go, you are required to have a look at the stalls. We've got a range of different ways in which you can join, and we've got a letter to Dan Andrews that highlights some of the issues. In fact, we were a bit prescient. We managed, I think, to get quite a few of the things that you've raised that you want to see the state government pressured on, and we want support for state government as well. So letters are to be signed. There's as I say, a variety of groups for you just cast your eye over the range of them and see if you can't contribute to them. We're not the only little group that's doing this. There are bigger groups around too. And as you go towards the back there, we have a bonus for you. This, in the foyer, as you leave, Tom Kompas has brought with him 50 copies, the last 50 copies that have been published of his booklet called Australia's Clean Energy Future, which he used the data from tonight. There are but 50, and so we're saying if you really want one, you might want to part with a couple of dollars for that on the way out. Call in on the table on the right. The table on the left has our little machine for cards that might be interested in picking up a donation from you. On that dreadful note of saying, help us do this sort of thing again, I would like just one more time for you to give a resounding thank you to a most exceptional panel tonight. Thank you.